But really having electric vehicles will not help global warming. And here's why. The electricity still has to be generated somewhere.
And the movies of the last 10 years have basically been, all they're doing is turning the various tropes of Western civilization on its head.
Hello and welcome. This is Deep Dive and I'm Tiffany Meier. We are here at the National Conservatism Conference in Orlando, Florida. And one of the big questions right now, is EV the future? And what effect does electric vehicles have on the climate? We sat down with Diana Furchtgott-Roth, Senior Fellow at the Manhattan Institute for Policy Research and former Acting Secretary for Economic Policy at the Treasury Department. And what about cancel culture, not just in Hollywood, but the impacts around the country? We sat down with Amanda Milius, director and producer, to hear her thoughts. Let's dive in. Well, Diana, thank you so much for joining us. Great to have you.
Oh, well, it's an honor to be on your show.
So it sounds like right now a lot of people are saying EV or electric vehicles are the future, but what's your stance on that?
Last year, only 3% of vehicle sales in the United States were EV. And of those, 2/3 were Tesla vehicles. So the number of electric vehicles that Americans want to buy is very small compared with the number they buy overall. So it's going to be difficult to get them to change their behavior. Plus, EVs are going to be more expensive. So the most popular vehicle sold in America today is the Ford F-150 pickup truck. And Ford has developed an electric vehicle version of that, but it's $10,000 more expensive for the base version. Plus, electric vehicles have limited range. You go perhaps 200, 250, at the very most 300 miles, then you have to recharge. And recharging isn't just like filling up with gasoline, which takes maybe 5 minutes. It takes half an hour for one of these vehicles to recharge. So say you're going on a long cross-country trip. Do you really want to wait half an hour every 250 miles for your vehicle to recharge? Most Americans are very impatient, and they would say no.
So why do you think there is this kind of argument and push for it if it doesn't sound very practical?
People are quite rightly concerned about the environment. They're concerned about climate change, and they think that if they have electric vehicles, this will help the climate. These people are very, very well intentioned. But really having electric vehicles will not help global warming. And here's why. The electricity still has to be generated somewhere. When you have gasoline, you observe that there are emissions coming out of the tailpipe. When you have an electric vehicle, it seems very clean. But to produce the electricity, to make that electric vehicle go, you have to have a power plant. That power plant runs on maybe natural gas these days, maybe some coal, maybe some oil. You can't run all the power plants on solar and wind. We just don't have that technology. Plus, once you've generated the electricity at the power plant, it has to be distributed through the grid in order to get to the vehicle. That also takes more energy. And you have to make the batteries. Most of the batteries are made in China now. And you have to ship them across to the United States. When they're finished, you have to dispose of them. You have to do mining to get the very expensive minerals that are in the batteries. So all that takes a lot of emissions. And that's why electric vehicles don't really save emissions, and they won't help us with global warming. They will just make us buy smaller, more inconvenient, more expensive cars without helping the environment at all.
So it almost sounds like A, this isn't helping the environment, and B, it's also not cost friendly.
Right.
So on the flip side, what would help in these two regards? Like the old kind of diesel car or?
Well, first of all, if you're looking at vehicle transportation, that's getting cleaner every year. Why? Because people's old cars are giving up and people are buying newer cars. So when my 2005 Jeep stops working, I'll have to buy a newer car, and maybe by then I'll be up to 2015. And the 2015 cars are more fuel efficient and have lower emissions than the 2005 cars. So we're in a constant position of replacing technology, and we're replacing more fuel-efficient vehicles with less fuel-efficient vehicles. We're also replacing coal with natural gas, unnaturally, because natural gas, until this past year, used to be much less expensive. So our environment here in the United States is getting gradually cleaner. and air is getting much cleaner. If we want to reduce total global emissions, we have to focus on those places where the emissions are highest, such as China, India, and then the newly developing emerging economies in Latin America and Africa. We need to make sure that they have the latest emissions-free technology, natural gas rather than coal. Nuclear power is also emissions-free. And we need to focus on those areas where the biggest emissions are coming from, not the United States. And that is what would help global warming, if you believe that emissions are a main driver of global warming. Thank you so much, Tiffany.
Yeah, thank you for coming on. Amanda, thank you so much for joining us. Great to have you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So you're a director, you've directed several films and produced, and so right now in Hollywood there seems to be kind of a hidden message that people might not realize. So what's your take on that?
Well, I don't even know how hidden it is. I mean, it seems really in your face, actually. Like, I think the thing that I've been talking about, the messaging behind current movies is so poisonous to the culture. I mean, this is one of the things that really matters to a culture and to a nation, is sort of the mythology that you know, the stories a culture tells itself about itself and projects outward are really impactful. I mean, I've always argued that movies are America's most important export, and the movies of the last 10 years have basically been, all they're doing is turning the various tropes of Western civilization on its head, whether that's something like the woke James Bond, which I've talked about before, but it's just it's just the opposite. It's basically taking the character and making it the opposite of everything that it ever was. And these things aren't frivolous, you know. I mean, these characters come out of there's a reason that the James Bond trope came out of the 1960s. It was a reaction to the sort of traditional family lifestyle. It was a very masculine presentation, and to have that totally turned on its head and made into this like feminized version, it's meant to be the opposite of what it always was. And yeah, in a bigger sense, I think that the messaging that the United States is putting out through movies and culture is always destructive now. It's always about how America is racist, about how there no longer is this underlying promise that America is a fundamentally good place, and that's something that even when you had movies that were critical of American culture all throughout cinema history, there was this underlying message that the United States was a good place, and we don't really have that anymore, and that's a very dangerous thing, and other countries don't do that. Other cultures aren't doing that. China, for example, is definitely not putting out anything that is at all this self-reflexive, like self-critical content.
So why do you think we're doing that in America?
Because I think that the forces that are directing what gets made, what content gets made, they're all that's what they all believe. So you've got basically there's no diversity of thought in the movies that come out from Hollywood. It's all extremely left wing, and that entire faction of political thought is critical of the United States and of United States history, and not just critical but destructive. It's like I said, it's a big leap beyond just looking at American culture and criticizing it. It's much worse than that. So I mean there's no room for any divergent thought in mainstream Hollywood. It's and a lot of it is controlled by international forces. I mean, one of the things I think people are finally catching on to is how much of an effect China really does have in Hollywood. And this has been going on for much longer than people realize. I mean, this has been going on for 20 years, not 10 years, at least, with China buying up huge portions of companies that have massive sway in what gets made and what doesn't, in addition to their market influencing what films make it over into the Chinese market and the way films are designed in order to appeal to that market. I mean, Hollywood's entire economy is built on the international market. They don't make movies just for Americans anymore. Every single movie pretty much has to survive in the international marketplace.
So you mentioned earlier how kind of movies in the past would kind of show the mythology or history of, say, the country. But going forward, what are some of the dangers you see with people just seeing these kinds of movies? What's that going to mean for the future?
Well, basically, I think it's dangerous because you can do policy all day long and not really move the needle, but film and culture and TV, it moves the needle faster than anything. I mean, and regardless of what you think about this issue, it's always an interesting issue to look at, which is, for example, like gay marriage, which I don't really have a terribly strong opinion about. I think it's fine, whatever. But it was something where no American political candidate could have come out and said that they were pro-gay marriage. Obama's last term that he was running for, he wasn't able to, American culture was such that he wasn't able to say that he was pro-gay marriage until halfway through his term. By the time Trump ran, a Republican, he was the first president that ran saying that he was fine with gay marriage, that he was pro-gay marriage. That's how fast the culture and the opinion in the United States and the idea of what was an acceptable opinion changed overnight, and that's not done by policy. That was done because the issue was presented in television shows, in movies, it was in, academic programming, it was presented in the culture, and that's what changed American opinion on it that fast. And that's a very, very quick swing on an issue that at one point was very divisive. So if you imagine that on every single issue, if you imagine that swing being possible on any type of issue, I mean, the culture is just constantly pushed and primed to accept a farther and farther left-wing ideology via the culture and the stories that we're telling ourselves. And at this point, I mean, yeah, they're destructive, it's dangerous, because all they're doing is messaging. I mean, like I said, movies being America's best export, the only thing we're announcing to the world as the United States is our weaknesses. And other countries aren't doing that. It's actually really dangerous.
And so what can be done to kind of stem this tide or turn it around?
I mean, it's hard to say because really, there's no hope in fixing mainstream Hollywood. I mean, luckily for me, I don't have to work with them. So I think a lot of independent financing is really important, and independent production companies. I run a production company that makes our own stuff. We don't have to get permission from anybody, and I think that's going to be really important, is to just have more and more divergent and sort of dissident content creators making content.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And for those just tuning in, that was today's episode with Diana Furchtgott-Roth and Amanda Milius. But what do you think? Let me know below. Thanks for tuning in to Deep Dive. I'm Tiffany Meier, and see you soon.